And we're back. Welcome to the latest edition of the Food Systems Podcast, brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. I am, of course, Mark Titterington, your host for the next 20 minutes or so. And today, to mark our return after the summer break, and it's a great pleasure to be talking to Ann Tutwiler, who joined our advisory council earlier in the year. She needs a little introduction. Chair of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, Senior Fellow at the Meridian Institute, and of course, former Director General of Bioversity International. And really great to have you with us. Looking forward to our conversation. We talk about the forum's mission, which I think, many of us share across the system. It's not unique to the forum. We want to build a more resilient, sustainable food and ag system, climate smart, nature positive. Based on your extensive experience and expertise, how important do you think it is to make this transition, and why?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mark, for having me on this podcast. Well, I can't imagine anything more important, frankly, than seeing agriculture move from where it is now, unfortunately, being seen as a contributor to many of the world's problems in terms of diet and nutrition, in terms of climate change and environment, to a system that is contributing to improving the environment, improving nutrition, and improving our resilience to climate change, but also reducing the contribution of agriculture to greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's really interesting now that so many people, both inside the sector and outside the sector, are recognizing how important this is. This is not just a niche movement anymore. It's really becoming maybe not mainstream enough, but it's becoming mainstream.
I think the interesting part about this discussion, and we should say that we're doing this podcast from New York, Climate Week, obviously UN General Assembly, Clinton Global Initiative is here, and food and agriculture and the transition features across all of those different agendas. At times, it feels that the conversation has perhaps maybe even become a little bit repetitive, and people are asking, what is the progress that we're making, and what gives them cause for optimism that we can get there? How would you assess where we are on the scale of progress, and what gives you cause for optimism?
Yeah. So I remember when we first started having these conversations, in earnest, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when I was at FAO and when I was at Bioversity, and it was very much seen as, oh, isn't that nice?
Right.
Isn't that a nice conversation to be having? And now what I find is, one, there are a lot of organizations, private sector companies, and of course NGOs, but also the UN, national governments, who are really understanding how important this agenda is, and really making concrete efforts to move forward in terms of creating the market incentives and for farmers to switch to a more regenerative, sustainable agricultural system. And also, I think, on the part of consumers. And I'll just tell you a quick story. I was on an airplane last night next to a dad with 3 screaming children, but we did manage to get in that he owns a small chain of restaurants here in Washington, D.C. And the first thing he said to me, he says, "Oh, I met Congresswoman so-and-so, and we talked about the importance of climate change and agriculture and the importance of food waste and reducing food waste to help deal with climate change." This was a random conversation on an airplane last night.
Yeah.
So I just think it's becoming more commonly understood, and people are beginning to, either on the demand side or the supply side, put their money where their mouths are.
Yeah. I mean, I think, for me, come to a couple of things myself over the last few years. The cause for optimism, I think, as you say, is that we've probably never had as greater interest in food and agriculture, not just from the usual players, but organizations, companies that perhaps might not have been in a technology, new startups, financial institutions. That gives one the cause for optimism for sure. If there's a theme that kind of comes through some of the conversations, at least I've been part of, is at times that the sheer challenge of transitioning the system is its complexity, its scale, and everybody obviously has a piece of that. I don't know if you have a perspective on that, and indeed other challenges that you think we're going to have to overcome to turn the intent into reality.
So a couple things. So one is that unfortunately, in many developed countries who have the money to support their farmers through public policies are still not devoting enough of those resources and creating enough incentives for farmers to change their production systems and to change what they're planting. In the US, we have programs that are important, but it hasn't yet changed the focus of the big commodity programs. And I think that's true in a number of countries. And so that's one thing that I think really has to change is we have to start, the governments of the world have to start sending better signals to farmers and to be helping them with the transition. I mean, this is, as you say, the systems are complex. Farmers have been growing the same thing for years. They have machinery that's suited to those crops, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's helpful that we do have private companies now who are prioritizing more sustainable, resilient systems. But the governments are spending a lot of money that is keeping the system stuck in kind of the old ways.
One of the challenges in that as well that I just reflect on is governments also trying to find their way and understand what their role is, and sometimes that can oscillate a little bit from enabling and facilitating to sometimes wanting to replicate what others are better at doing, and I think again trying to find that happy balance between what government does, what private sector does, what civil society does is something that we need to keep working on. And I think, again, when I listen to some of the conversations around town this week, that's definitely on the agenda. It makes me ask, though, again, myself, with no criticism intended, just how important events like UN General Assembly, Climate Week, COP29, obviously coming up in November, how important they are in driving momentum for change. I don't know what your perspective on that is, Anne.
I'm not in New York. That might say something. No, look, I think in the early days when we were having these conversations, it was really important. These kinds of meetings were important because it was about helping people understand what the issues were, what the challenges were, what the solutions were. And now I think by and large, the people who are going to these big meetings, Climate Week, the UN General Assembly, Davos, I mean, all of these places, they get it.
Yeah.
They get it. They understand it. So it's not those people who need to be convinced.
Yeah.
And look, it's always a useful thing to be in these big meetings where everybody you need to talk to is there, and you can, come up with creative ideas about how to move things forward. But these are not the people that you need to convince that something needs to be done.
And I think also when think about obviously where we are in the commodity price cycle, the farmer voice and how you translate that into action at the farm level when some of those farmers are really just trying to get through the season, the year. Some of them questioning whether they'll still be in business. How do they stay in business? We've got to translate that into something that I think is understandable for them in order to progress. And I still think that's a bit of a missing link for me in some of these meetings.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things you asked earlier about what gives me optimism. So when I first started engaging in these conversations and seeing these conversations being engaged. I actually had a meeting in Berlin around the Green Week with the head of the Farmers Union at the time, the World Farmers Union at the time, and he almost didn't meet with me. Yeah, no, really. I mean, because he said, "Look, you know, everybody's blaming us,
Right.
Everybody's blaming us for all these troubles," and he said, "We're just trying to, you know, feed people." And you know, we're responding to what the market and what governments are trying to tell us to do. And what I think has changed through a lot of hard work by people like the Forum and many others is that farmers have to be at the table, and they are not as much as maybe they need to be, but they are there. And we have to understand that they want to be part of the solution and they can be part of the solution, but not if certain groups are constantly blaming them for causing these, you know, these problems. I mean, I just don't see the kind of negative condemnation of farmers that you know, among the environmental NGOs that I saw 5-10 years ago. I mean, that whole song has changed.
And I think that's you know, again, is for the positive, and I think the, you know, the optimism, if it comes from anywhere, comes from that there is a way through this if again we can align the incentives. I think if we send the right signals to the farmers, as you were saying, with the right incentives, farmers will respond. I mean, I personally have never met a farmer that doesn't want to do anything other than improve the environment on his or her land.
Right.
And it's really about getting them to do more and paying them for what they do, which of course the market hasn't always done. And I wonder if I can transition to another point here. You know, it is a year of change, political change on both sides of the Atlantic. We have a new commission that's been proposed, new parliament in Europe. Obviously, I wouldn't necessarily expect you to comment on that, but you know, fascinating election campaign debate underway here in the US, presidential, congressional elections. How important do you see those in the context of the agri-food system transformation, and what advice, if any, would you give to the new administration in this respect, whoever it might be?
So the first thing I would say is that US agriculture is highly dependent on exports, highly dependent on having, you know, open markets, obviously not dealing with unfair competition, but having open markets. And I think, you know, both parties here have become more protectionist. I would say the Republican Party is more in that direction than the Democratic Party at the moment. But US farmers can't survive if they can't export.
Right.
You know, the share of the world population that lives in the US is pretty small. So that's one thing I think that is important to watch what both of these campaigns say about their willingness to impose trade barriers and tariffs on foreign countries that could be, you know, even if we're imposing trade tariffs on you know, computer chips, it's going to come back to bite on, you know, soybeans and other exports. So I think that's an important thing. The other thing, of course, you know, along the lines of the conversation we've been having, is that there are unfortunately still a number of Republicans who profess not to believe in climate change. And I think, given the realities as I see them of climate change and the need for farmers to, if nothing else, adapt, but more than that, to help mitigate, I think if a Republican administration comes back this time around, we will see many of the programs that the current administration has put in place to help farmers adapt and mitigate climate change will be completely abandoned and reversed. So I think that's the second thing. And then I think the third thing, you know, this is very much in a US context, you know, the reason the food assistance programs were created for, poor people in the school lunch, women and children's programs, et cetera, were created in the first place was to create some demand for farmers.
Yeah.
And now, again, there's, I think, a pretty wide divergence between the Republican Party that generally wants to reduce those benefits, and Democratic Party, which hopes to expand them. So that's another important element of demand in terms of the U.S. markets. And then the last thing I would say, well, we're not so concerned in this conversation with the nutrition piece, but helping consumers move towards healthier diets that are going to reduce healthcare costs is also, I think, a big difference between the two parties. And those signals are gonna go back to the farmers in terms of what they should plant and not plant. So I think there's actually pretty stark differences on offer between the two parties.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating context, and obviously of great interest, not just to us in Europe, but to others around the world. So we obviously look forward to seeing how that plays out. You touched on nutrition there, and I don't want to necessarily draw you into that if you don't want to go there. But as we kind of bring our conversation to an end, I'm just interested, as you've joined the advisory council, would love to hear your advice, counsel to all of us in the forum, really, to come near and beyond on how we do fulfill its mission. And as we've said, it is the transformation of the agri-food system. So it should be broad. Would love to hear your thoughts on that from the first couple of months that you've been helping us and providing invaluable counsel.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to my role as Director General of Bioversity International, where when I came to that organization, there was a lot of focus about diversification of production systems. And we sort of took a look at our strategy and said, well, farmers aren't going to diversify what they're producing until there's a demand for that diversity out in the marketplace. And so we totally switched from having sort of a supply-driven conversation to a demand-driven conversation. And the links between dietary diversity and health, human health, public health, and diversity in production systems are incredibly tight, right? And I don't think you can have a conversation about improving resilience, improving sustainability, if you don't have a conversation about diversifying production systems, even growing different varieties of maize. I mean, even
right,
or you grow several different kinds of crops in an area that can help improve your soil health, reduce pest pressures, all of those things, but can also provide consumers with a more diversified and healthier diet. So I think, to me, this notion of diversification, which also helps you with climate change, by the way. So, to me, that's the golden link.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely grand, and I've really enjoyed chatting to you this afternoon here. It's always great to have these kind of conversations with someone who's got, if I may say, a fairly unique perspective on how we manage some of the challenges, but also exploit some of the opportunities that are absolutely in front of us. And as I say, we couldn't be more delighted that you're with us on the advisory council. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to another episode of the Food Systems Podcast, brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. We hope you enjoyed it and hope you'll join us again next time. All for now.